She sat at the conference table in the courthouse signing divorce papers, while her husband made jokes about how easily she was giving up, how she was walking away with nothing, how she'd probably be taking the bus home. He'd spent the entire hearing smirking, whispering sarcastic comments to his attorney, openly celebrating his victory. He'd kept the house, the investment accounts, most of the assets they had built together over 15 years of marriage. She'd signed everything without argument, without tears, without the fight he'd expected. Just calm signatures on page after page, her expression neutral, her voice quiet when the judge asked if she understood what she was agreeing to. Her silence made him more confident, more cruel. He told his attorney loud enough for her to hear that she was finally learning her place, that she should have been this agreeable during the marriage. She didn't respond, just collected her purse, thanked the clerk, and walked toward the courthouse exit. He called after her, "Better hurry before your ride home disappears." Assuming she'd take a cab because he'd made sure she couldn't afford much else, she just nodded and kept walking. Outside, a sound interrupted the afternoon. A jet engine, low and close, landing at the private airstrip visible from the courthouse steps. People looked up confused. Then a black Rolls-Royce pulled up to the courthouse entrance. A man stepped out. Tailored suit, confident bearing, clearly wealthy. He walked directly to her, embraced her gently, took her bag, opened the car door. Her husband had followed her outside to continue mocking and froze mid-sentence. Because the jet wasn't random, it was there for her. And the man helping her into the Rolls-Royce wasn't a driver. He was her new partner, a billionaire investor who'd been quietly supporting her, helping her structure the divorce so she could exit cleanly while keeping assets her ex-husband never knew existed offshore. The husband watched his ex-wife drive toward the private jet in a car worth more than their house, leaving with a man worth more than he'd ever see in 10 lifetimes, while he stood on courthouse steps realizing her silence hadn't been defeat. It had been strategy, and he'd just lost everything while thinking he'd won. Thursday, October the 26th, 2023, 2:15 p.m., County Courthouse, Family Court Division. The conference room was small and clinical, beige walls that had absorbed 15 years of bitter arguments, fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly sickly, a long table where bitter marriages came to die through paperwork and signatures. The air conditioning hummed constantly, just loud enough to be annoying, just cold enough to be uncomfortable. This was where love ended, not with passion or drama, but with legal language and notarized signatures. At one end sat Jonathan Pierce, 43 years old, dressed in a charcoal Tom Ford suit that had cost him $3,500, an extravagance he'd justified as dressing for success, but that really served to broadcast wealth and superiority. His tie was Hermes. His watch was a Rolex Submariner, not the expensive one, but expensive enough to impress most people. His shoes were Ferragamo Oxfords polished to mirror shine. Everything about his appearance was calculated to project success and control. He was flanked by his attorney, Marcus Webb, a divorce specialist with a reputation for aggressive asset protection and a win rate that bordered on legendary. Marcus had represented Jonathan throughout the proceedings, had helped structure the settlement to maximize Jonathan's retention of assets, and had billed approximately $85,000 for his services. Money Jonathan considered well spent given the favorable outcome. At the other end of the table sat Catherine Pierce. She'd legally become Catherine Moreau again after today, 41 years old, wearing a simple but elegant navy dress from Theory, minimal jewelry, a pearl necklace. That had been her grandmother's small diamond studs, no wedding ring. Her dark hair pulled back in a neat bun that emphasized her striking features. She wore minimal makeup and no perfume. Her appearance suggested someone attending a business meeting rather than the legal dissolution of a 15-year marriage. Beside her sat Linda Martinez, a solo practitioner who'd been representing Catherine. Linda was 52, had been practicing family law for 26 years, and had learned to read the dynamics of divorcing couples with uncomfortable accuracy. This case had puzzled her from the start. Catherine had legitimate claims to significantly more assets, but had instructed Linda to accept terms that were objectively unfavorable. Linda had pushed back initially, had tried to advocate more aggressively, but Catherine had been adamant. Accept the terms. I want this over quickly. Between them sat Judge Patricia Coleman, a family court judge who'd been on the bench for 18 years and had overseen approximately 4,000 divorce settlements. She'd developed a practice neutrality that allowed her to manage proceedings without letting personal opinions about the couple's behavior interfere with her legal obligations. But even Judge Coleman, who prided herself on professional detachment, found Jonathan Pierce distasteful. His behavior throughout the proceedings had been arrogant, dismissive, and cruel in ways that suggested he viewed divorce not as the sad ending of a partnership, but as a victory to be celebrated. Jonathan had been talking, actually gloating, for the past 45 minutes while final documents were prepared and organized for signatures. His commentary had been constant and condescending, delivered in a tone that suggested he was sharing wisdom with people who should be grateful for his insights. "You know, Marcus, I've been thinking," Jonathan said, his voice carrying across the table, despite the fact that he was supposedly addressing only his attorney. "This whole process really shows you how important it is to keep assets in your name. I mean, the business is mine, the house is mine, the investments are in my name. Catherine contributed, sure, but legally she can't prove how much, and that makes all the difference." Marcus made a non-committal sound, clearly uncomfortable with his client's behavior, but unwilling to criticize him openly during active proceedings. "I told her years ago that she should focus on supporting my business instead of doing her own consulting work," Jonathan continued. "If she'd listened, maybe she'd understand business better. Maybe she wouldn't be walking away with so little." Catherine didn't react. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, her expression neutral, her posture relaxed. She'd learned during 15 years of marriage that engaging with Jonathan when he was in this mood only encouraged him. Silence was more effective. Jonathan interpreted her silence as defeat, which made him more emboldened. "Marcus, what's the final breakdown? Just so I'm clear on the numbers." Marcus pulled out a summary document. "You're retaining the primary residence valued at $1.2 million with remaining mortgage of $300,000, so net equity of $900,000. You're retaining the lake house valued at $450,000, fully paid. You're retaining investment accounts totaling approximately $800,000. You're retaining your business interests valued at approximately $500,000 to $700,000, depending on valuation method. You're retaining both luxury vehicles, the BMW and the Mercedes, collectively valued at $125,000. Total retained assets, approximately $2.975 million to $3.175 million. And Catherine gets the Honda Accord valued at $12,000, cash settlement of $75,000. Her choice of furniture and personal items from the marital home valued at approximately $15,000 to $20,000. Total, approximately $102,000 to $107,000. So I'm keeping about 97% of marital assets. In terms of dollar value, yes." Jonathan leaned back in his chair, a satisfied smile on his face. "That seems fair. I built those assets. I earned them. Catherine was along for the ride, but she wasn't the driver, if you know what I mean." Linda Martinez spoke for the first time in 20 minutes, her voice carefully controlled. "For the record, Mrs. Pierce contributed significantly to building those assets through her direct financial contributions, her professional advice that helped grow Mr. Pierce's business, and her emotional and logistical support during critical business periods. Under Virginia equitable distribution laws, she would likely be entitled to 40 to 50% of marital assets if this went to contested litigation. Which is why we negotiated," Jonathan said smoothly. "Catherine understands that litigation is expensive and uncertain. She's being smart by accepting a sure thing rather than gambling on what a judge might award." He looked at Catherine directly for the first time in minutes. "Right, Catherine, you're being smart here, taking what's offered rather than fighting for more and ending up with less after legal fees." Catherine met his gaze calmly. "I'm accepting these terms because I want the divorce finalized quickly, that's all. See, smart woman, finally." Jonathan's tone was patronizing, as if praising a child for making an obvious choice. Judge Coleman intervened. "Mr. Pierce, these sidebar comments are unnecessary. Let's proceed with finalizing the settlement so everyone can move forward." "Of course, Your Honor. I'm just trying to keep things amicable." Jonathan's tone suggested he believed he was being reasonable, and that anyone who thought otherwise was being oversensitive. Judge Coleman pulled the settlement agreement in front of her and began reviewing key provisions aloud, a required procedure to ensure both parties understood what they were agreeing to. The marital home, located at 2247 Oakwood Drive, shall be retained by Mr. Pierce, with Mrs. Moreau releasing all claims to said property, Jonathan whispered to Marcus, but not quietly enough. She loved that house, spent years decorating it. Now she gets to watch me live there with Jennifer. Jennifer was the 28-year-old paralegal Jonathan had been having an affair with, the relationship that had precipitated the divorce when Catherine had discovered texts and hotel receipts that made denial impossible. Jonathan had moved Jennifer into the house 3 weeks ago, before the divorce was even finalized, redecorating Catherine's carefully chosen spaces with Jennifer's preferences. Catherine's expression didn't change, but Linda Martinez's jaw tightened. The vacation property at Lake Anna shall be retained by Mr. Pierce, with Mrs. Moreau releasing all claims despite her contribution of $200,000 from inheritance funds toward its purchase. That inheritance was a gift to both of us, Jonathan said to Marcus. Technically, her grandmother left it to her, but we were married, so it was community property. That's how marriage works. What's yours becomes ours. Well, was ours. Now it's mine. The logic was twisted, but Jonathan delivered it with complete confidence, as if he'd explained something obvious that everyone should have already understood. Investment accounts held at Merrill Lynch, Charles Schwab, and Vanguard, totaling approximately $800,000, shall be retained by Mr. Pierce, with Mrs. Moreau releasing all claims. We built those together, Jonathan said, his voice taking on a false tone of magnanimity. I contributed the money, Catherine contributed, well, moral support, I guess. That counts for something, just not for half. Judge Coleman looked up from the document, her patience clearly wearing thin. Mr. Pierce, I'm going to ask you one more time to refrain from commentary during the reading of this settlement. Apologies, Your Honor. I'm just emotionally processing the end of my marriage. He didn't sound apologetic or emotional. He sounded triumphant. The reading continued. Vehicle allocation, furniture division, debt responsibility, tax filing procedures, name change provisions. Every clause represented another piece of a shared life being divided, cataloged, and distributed. Finally, Judge Coleman reached the alimony section. Both parties waive any claim to spousal support or alimony, agreeing to a clean break with no ongoing financial obligations to each other. That was Catherine's idea, actually, Jonathan said, unable to resist commentary despite Judge Coleman's warnings. She specifically requested no alimony. I was willing to pay some, but she said she didn't want ongoing connection. I respect that. Shows she's ready to move on with her life. What Jonathan didn't say, what he genuinely believed, was that Catherine had waived alimony because she knew she couldn't get much, given that she'd been working during the marriage and had her own income. In Jonathan's mind, Catherine had waived alimony from a position of weakness, accepting that she couldn't make claims on his ongoing income. The reality was quite different, but Jonathan had no way of knowing that yet. Judge Coleman finished reading the settlement and looked at both parties. Mrs. Moreau, I need to confirm that you understand these terms fully. You're aware that you may be entitled to a significantly larger share of marital assets under Virginia equitable distribution statutes? Yes, Your Honor, I'm aware. You've had the opportunity to consult with your attorney about the implications of accepting these terms? Yes, Your Honor. I've discussed this extensively with Ms. Martinez. And you're entering into this agreement voluntarily, without coercion or pressure. I am, Your Honor. Judge Coleman studied Catherine for a long moment, clearly trying to understand why someone would accept such unfavorable terms. Mrs. Moreau, want to be very clear. Once you sign this agreement, it becomes a binding legal contract. You cannot later claim you didn't understand or that you were pressured. If you have any doubts, now is the time to address them. I have no doubts, Your Honor. I want to sign. Very well. Judge Coleman slid the settlement agreement across the table to Catherine. Catherine picked up the pen provided, a standard ballpoint, nothing special, the kind of pen used to sign documents ending marriages and changing lives, and began signing, page after page, her signature steady. Her hand didn't shake, Her expression remained calm. Jonathan watched her sign and felt a surge of satisfaction so intense it was almost physical. He'd won. Completely. He was keeping everything that mattered while Catherine walked away with pocket change and a used car. "You know, Catherine," he said, unable to contain himself, "I really do think this is the best outcome for both of us. You get a fresh start without the burden of maintaining properties or managing investments. You can focus on, I don't know, whatever it is you want to do, find yourself, or whatever." Catherine signed another page without responding. "And I get to keep the life I've built, the house I've paid for, the business I've grown, the investments I've made, everything I've worked for. That seems fair, doesn't it?" Another signature, another page signed away. "Jennifer's excited about redecorating the house, by the way. She has great taste, more modern than your style. I think you'll like what she does with it if you ever visit." He knew Catherine would never visit. The comment was purely to twist the knife. More signatures, more pages. "Oh, and about the lake house. I'm thinking about selling it, actually. Never use it as much as we should have. Should have. Past tense. Jennifer and I prefer traveling internationally. The lake house feels a bit provincial. Might get $500,000 for it. That'll fund some nice trips." The lake house that Catherine's grandmother's inheritance had purchased. The lake house where Catherine and Jonathan had celebrated anniversaries, hosted family gatherings, created memories that Jonathan was now casually discussing selling because it felt provincial. Catherine signed the page relating to the lake house without hesitation. Finally, the last page. Catherine signed, dated, and slid the completed documents across the table to Judge Coleman. "Mr. Pierce, please review and sign." Jonathan took his time, making a show of reading through each provision, even though he'd reviewed the agreement multiple times already. This was theater, demonstrating his careful consideration, his business acumen, his control over the process. He signed with a flourish on each page, his signature large and aggressive, taking up more space than necessary. This was his victory document, and he wanted his mark to be unmistakable. Judge Coleman witnessed both signatures, made notes on her copy, and looked at both parties. "The court accepts this settlement agreement. The marriage between Jonathan Pierce and Catherine Moreau. Pierce is hereby dissolved effective immediately. Ms. Moreau, you are free to resume use of your maiden name. Mr. Pierce, you are free to remarry without restriction. The terms of this settlement are legally binding. Do either party have any final questions?" "No, Your Honor," Catherine said quietly. "Just wanted to say thank you, Your Honor," Jonathan said, his voice full of false sincerity. "I appreciate you helping us reach such a fair and amicable resolution. Not all divorces go this smoothly." Judge Coleman's expression suggested she thought there'd been nothing particularly amicable about this divorce, but she simply nodded. "This hearing is concluded. You're both free to go. The clerk will provide you with certified copies of the divorce decree within 10 business days." Catherine stood, collected her purse, a modest leather bag, in dark brown that Jonathan had once called shabby during an argument, and thanked Judge Coleman. "Thank you for your time and patience, Your Honor. Ms. Moreau, if you need any information about court services or resources available to people going through divorce, the clerk's office can—" "Thank you, but that won't be necessary. I have everything I need." Catherine walked toward the door. Jonathan couldn't resist one final comment, calling after her with false concern laced with mockery. "Catherine, wait, do you need money for a cab? I mean, I know your settlement doesn't include much cash, and I wouldn't want you to have to take the bus home. I could lend you $20 if you need it." She paused at the door, turned to look at him one last time. Her expression was completely neutral. No anger, no hurt, no emotion at all. Just calm assessment. "I'll be fine, Jonathan. Thank you for your concern. Where are you staying anyway? Did you find an apartment you can afford? I have accommodations arranged." "Really? Because with $75,000 in cash, you're probably looking at a pretty modest place. Studio apartment, 1 bedroom if you're lucky, big step down from our house." He kept saying, "our house," even though the settlement had just made it exclusively his. "My living situation is comfortable. I'm satisfied with it. Bet it's a real step down, though. Maybe you should have fought harder for more money. Too late now." He laughed, looking at Marcus for validation. Marcus didn't laugh. He was watching Catherine with an expression that suggested he was trying to figure something out, trying to understand why she was so calm about walking away with so little. I mean, seriously, Catherine, what's your plan? You're 41 years old, you've got maybe $100,000 total from the settlement, you've got no house, no real career momentum, no prospects. That's rough. That's really rough. Maybe you should have thought about that before you got so upset about my relationship with Jennifer. Catherine looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she said very calmly, I hope you enjoy the house, Jonathan, and the business, and all the assets you fought so hard to keep. I hope they bring you everything you think they will. Something about her tone made Jonathan pause. It wasn't sarcastic, it wasn't angry, it was sincere. Like she genuinely hoped he'd be happy with what he'd won, which somehow made him angrier than if she'd been bitter. Oh, I will enjoy them, he said sharply. I'm going to enjoy living in that house with someone who actually appreciates what I've built, someone who doesn't question every decision I make, someone who understands that I'm the one who earned everything and deserves respect for it. Then we both got what we wanted, Catherine said simply. She walked out of the conference room, down the courthouse hallway with its worn linoleum floors and buzzing fluorescent lights, past the clerk's office where other couples were filing paperwork for their own divorces, past the courtrooms where other lives were being legally dismantled, toward the exit and whatever came next. Jonathan gathered his papers, shook hands with Marcus. That went even better than expected. She didn't fight anything, didn't push back, didn't demand more, just signed everything and walked away. Jonathan, Marcus said carefully, I have to say, something felt off about that. I've done hundreds of divorces. I've seen people give up when they're beaten down, when they can't afford to fight anymore, when they're exhausted. Catherine didn't look beaten down. She looked strategic. Strategic? Marcus, she walked away with basically nothing. That's not strategy, that's defeat. Maybe, but she didn't seem defeated. She seemed like someone who'd made a calculated decision. And in my experience, when people accept terms this unfavorable without fighting, it's usually because they have resources we don't know about, or leverage we're not seeing, or she's just finally accepted reality, Jonathan interrupted. Some people know when they're beaten. Catherine's smart enough to recognize she couldn't win. So she took what was offered rather than wasting time and money on lawyers fighting for assets she'd never get. Marcus didn't look convinced, but he didn't argue further. If you're happy with the outcome, that's what matters. I'm very happy. This is exactly what I wanted. Everything I built, I kept. Everything I earned, I protected. And Catherine learned an important lesson about consequences. They walked out of the courthouse together, Jonathan checking his phone and already thinking about how he'd celebrate dinner at that expensive steakhouse downtown. Maybe buy Jennifer that necklace she'd been hinting about. Maybe trade in the BMW for something newer now that he didn't have to worry about Catherine claiming half of everything he purchased. As they descended the courthouse steps toward the parking area, Jonathan saw Catherine standing near the curb about 30 feet away. She was holding her purse, looking at her phone, seemingly waiting for something. Probably calling a cab, Jonathan said to Marcus. Or one of those rideshare things, Uber, whatever poor people use. He was about to make another mocking comment when a sound interrupted the late afternoon quiet, a sound that didn't belong in suburban Virginia on a Thursday afternoon. A jet engine, low, close, getting louder. Jonathan looked up, as did Marcus, as did several other people leaving the courthouse and walking through the parking area. A private jet, sleek white, clearly expensive even from a distance, was descending toward Executive Airport. The private airstrip located less than a mile from the courthouse, visible through the clear autumn air. Must be some corporate executive, Marcus commented, shielding his eyes to watch the jet's approach. Probably someone actually important, Jonathan added, enjoying the implicit contrast with Catherine waiting alone for her cab. The jet touched down smoothly on the private runway, its engines powering down as it taxied toward the terminal buildings reserved for private aviation. Jonathan was about to turn back toward his BMW when he noticed something else. A car was pulling up to the courthouse curb, not at the taxi stand further down the street, not at the public pickup area, but directly in front of the main entrance where Catherine stood. And it wasn't just any car. It was a Rolls-Royce Phantom, sleek, black, immaculate, the kind of vehicle that cost upward of $500,000. The kind of vehicle Jonathan had dreamed about owning someday, but had never been able to afford despite his successful business and careful asset accumulation. The car pulled to a perfect stop in front of Catherine. The rear door opened, and a man stepped out. The other end sat Catherine Pierce. She'd be going back to her maiden name of Catherine Moreau after today. 41 years old, wearing a simple but elegant navy dress, minimal jewelry, her dark hair pulled back in a neat bun. Her attorney was Linda Martinez, a solo practitioner who specialized in representing women in divorces, but who seemed oddly quiet today, letting the other side dominate the proceedings. Between them sat mediator Judge Patricia Coleman, a family court judge who'd overseen thousands of divorce settlements and had learned to read the dynamics of ending marriages. This one was typical in its ugliness: husband controlling and smug, wife seemingly defeated and compliant, assets divided in ways that heavily favored the spouse with more aggressive legal representation. Jonathan had been talking, actually gloating, for the past 45 minutes while documents were finalized and prepared for signatures. "I still think this is more than fair," Jonathan said, directing his comments to his attorney, but speaking loud enough for everyone to hear. "I mean, she's getting the Honda, that's reliable transportation, and I'm not fighting her on the furniture she wants from the house. I'm being generous here." The generous settlement gave Jonathan the $1.2 million house they'd purchased together, the investment portfolio worth approximately $800,000, his business interests in a commercial real estate company, and both luxury vehicles except the Honda Accord Catherine had driven for the past 8 years. Catherine was getting the Honda, $75,000 in cash, and half the furniture. No alimony because they'd agreed to a clean break. It was, by any objective measure, a terrible deal for Catherine. She'd worked as a marketing consultant during most of their marriage, had helped build Jonathan's business through her contacts and advice, and should have been entitled to significantly more, but she'd instructed her attorney to accept the terms without negotiation. Catherine worked during the marriage, Linda Martinez had pointed out during an earlier session. She contributed financially and professionally to building the assets we're now dividing. She's entitled to more than this. "I want a clean break," Catherine had said calmly. "I'll accept these terms." Linda had tried to push back. It was her job to advocate for her client, but Catherine had been insistent. "Please, just accept the terms. I want this over." So, here they were, signing the papers that would legally end a 15-year marriage and leave Catherine with less than 10% of the marital assets while Jonathan walked away with everything else. Judge Coleman reviewed the settlement agreement one final time. "Mrs. Pierce, I need to confirm that you understand these terms and that you're entering into this agreement voluntarily without coercion." "I understand, Your Honor. I'm agreeing to these terms voluntarily." "You're aware that you may be entitled to a larger share of marital assets under Virginia law?" "I'm aware, Your Honor. I've discussed this with my attorney, and I accept these terms." Jonathan smirked at his attorney. This was even easier than he'd expected. Catherine had always been stubborn during their marriage, arguing about his spending, questioning his business decisions, refusing to be the compliant wife he'd wanted. And now, when it mattered, she was finally being agreeable, probably because she'd realized she had no leverage. His business was in his name. The house was in his name. The investments were in his name. She'd contributed, sure, but legally she couldn't prove how much, and fighting would cost legal fees she couldn't afford. He'd won. Completely. And it felt good. "Catherine, if you'd like to take a few minutes to review everything one final time," Judge Coleman began. "That's not necessary, Your Honor. I'm ready to sign." Judge Coleman nodded and slid the settlement agreement across the table. Catherine picked up the pen and began signing, page after page of legal documents that transferred her rights to property, assets, and investments. Her signature was steady. Her expression was calm. She showed no emotion, no tears, no anger, no regret. Jonathan whispered to his attorney, just loud enough for Catherine to hear, "I told you she'd fold. Women like her always do when you actually stand up to them." Catherine didn't react, just kept signing. "Mr. Pierce, please maintain appropriate decorum," Judge Coleman said sharply. "Of course, Your Honor. My apologies." Jonathan didn't sound apologetic. He sounded victorious. More signatures, more pages. The division of 15 years into legal paragraphs and bullet points. The house, Jonathan's. The cars, except the Honda, Jonathan's. The investment accounts, Jonathan's. The business, Jonathan's. The retirement accounts, split, but heavily weighted toward Jonathan because they'd been primarily in his name. She's even giving up the lake house, Jonathan said to Marcus, shaking his head in mock disbelief. We bought that together with money from her inheritance, and she's just letting me keep it. Incredible. The lake house in question was a property Catherine's grandmother had left her $200,000 for specifically. Catherine and Jonathan had used that money as a down payment on a vacation property on Lake Anna. Legally, that should have been Catherine's separate property, or at the very least, she should have been compensated for her contribution. But the settlement gave the lake house to Jonathan as part of the real estate portfolio, with no compensation to Catherine. Catherine signed that page without hesitation. Linda Martinez looked pained. She'd tried to protect the lake house, had argued it should be Catherine's separate property, had offered to fight for it. Catherine had refused. Let him have it, she'd said. I don't want it anymore. Finally, the last page. Catherine signed, dated, and slid the completed documents across the table to Judge Coleman. Mr. Pierce, please review and sign. Jonathan took his time reading through the settlement, not because he needed to review it, but because he was savoring this moment. The moment when he got everything he wanted, while his ex-wife got almost nothing. He signed with a flourish on each page, his signature large and confident. Judge Coleman witnessed both signatures, made notes on her copy, and looked at both parties. The court accepts this settlement agreement, the marriage between Jonathan Pierce and Catherine Moreau. Pierce is hereby dissolved. Ms. Moreau, she used Catherine's maiden name deliberately. You are free to resume use of your maiden name if you choose. The terms of this settlement are legally binding. Do either party have any final questions? No, Your Honor, Catherine said quietly. Just wanted to say thank you, Your Honor, for helping us reach an amicable resolution, Jonathan said, his tone, suggesting there had been no coercion, no power imbalance, just two reasonable adults agreeing to fair terms. Judge Coleman's expression suggested she didn't quite believe the resolution had been amicable, but her job was to ensure the process was legal, not to judge whether the outcome was wise. This hearing is concluded. You're both free to go. Catherine stood, collected her purse, a modest leather bag that Jonathan had once criticized as looking cheap, and thanked Judge Coleman. Thank you for your time, Your Honor. Ms. Moreau, if you'd like to speak with court services about resources, that won't be necessary. Thank you. Catherine walked toward the door. Jonathan called after her, his voice dripping with false concern. Catherine, wait. Do you need money for a cab? I wouldn't want you to have to take the bus home. She paused at the door, turned to look at him one last time. Her expression was completely neutral. I'll be fine, Jonathan. Thank you for your concern. Where are you staying anyway? Did you find an apartment? I have accommodations arranged. Bet it's a real step down from the house, huh? Maybe you should have fought harder. He laughed, looking at his attorney for validation. Marcus laughed uncomfortably, less pleased with his client's behavior than Jonathan seemed to expect. Catherine didn't respond. She just walked out of the conference room, down the courthouse hallway, and toward the exit. Jonathan gathered his papers, shook hands with his attorney. Marcus, that went even better than expected. She didn't fight anything. Jonathan, I should mention, something felt off about that. She gave up too easily. I've done hundreds of divorces, and I've never seen someone with legitimate claims just surrender everything. She gave up because she knows I earned it. I built that business. I made the money. She was just along for the ride. She contributed significantly to, Marcus, I'm paying you to win, which you did. Don't second-guess victory. They walked out of the courthouse together, Jonathan checking his phone and already thinking about his plans for the evening. He'd call Jennifer, the 28-year-old paralegal he'd been seeing for the past 6 months, the relationship that had precipitated the divorce when Catherine had found out. Jennifer would be impressed that he'd kept everything. Maybe they'd celebrate at that expensive restaurant downtown, the one Catherine had always said was too pricey. As Jonathan walked down the courthouse steps, he saw Catherine standing near the curb, holding her purse, looking at her phone. She was probably calling a cab, or maybe using one of those rideshare apps. Either way, she was alone, broke, relatively speaking, and finally facing the consequences of thinking she deserved equal treatment in a marriage where he'd been the primary earner. He was about to make another comment when a sound interrupted the late afternoon quiet. A jet engine, low, close, getting louder. Jonathan looked up, as did Marcus, as did several other people leaving the courthouse. A private jet, sleek, white, expensive, was descending toward the private airstrip at Executive Airport, a small facility for private aircraft located less than a mile from the courthouse, visible from where they stood. "Must be some executive coming in for business," Marcus commented. Jonathan watched the jet touch down, still visible through the clear afternoon air. Then he looked back at Catherine, expecting to see her still waiting for her cab. Instead, he saw a black Rolls-Royce Phantom pulling up to the courthouse curb, not at the taxi stand, but directly in front of the entrance where Catherine stood. The car was immaculate, probably worth $500,000. The kind of vehicle Jonathan had always wanted but could never quite afford despite his successful business. The rear door opened and a man stepped out. He was in his early 50s, tall, distinguished, wearing a suit that probably cost more than Jonathan's car. His silver hair was perfectly styled. His watch, Jonathan recognized it even from a distance, was a Patek Philippe, easily $100,000. Everything about him screamed wealth, not the kind of wealth Jonathan had worked hard to accumulate, but the kind of wealth that came from generations of success or massive business achievements. The man walked directly to Catherine. She turned, saw him, and smiled, the first genuine smile Jonathan had seen on her face in years. The man embraced her gently, respectfully, then took her bag. He opened the car door and helped her inside, his movements courteous and attentive. Jonathan stood on the courthouse steps, frozen, his brain trying to process what he was seeing. "Who the hell is that?" he said to Marcus. Marcus was staring at the car. I don't know." The Rolls-Royce pulled away from the curb, driving smoothly down the street, not toward downtown where apartments would be affordable for someone with $75,000 in divorce settlement money. Not toward the suburbs where Catherine might have found a rental. Toward the airport. Toward the private airstrip where the jet had just landed. "Is that—" Jonathan couldn't finish the sentence. The Rolls-Royce entered the private airport gate, driving directly onto the tarmac. The security guard waved it through without stopping it, pre-cleared, expected, authorized. The car pulled up beside the jet. The man got out, helped Catherine out, and walked with her up the stairs to the aircraft. Catherine didn't look back, just walked up the stairs, into the jet, and disappeared from view. Within minutes, the jet's engines powered up. It taxied to the runway and took off, climbing into the afternoon sky, carrying Catherine away from the courthouse, away from Jonathan, away from the life she'd just legally extricated herself from. Jonathan stood on the courthouse steps watching the jet disappear. Into the distance, his mind racing through implications he was only beginning to understand. Catherine hadn't taken a cab. She hadn't needed to fight for assets. She hadn't been defeated. She'd been strategic. And Jonathan had just learned that the woman he'd mocked for walking away with nothing had been walking towards something he couldn't begin to compete with. Continuing with parts 2, 3, and 4, the revelation, the truth, the aftermath. Jonathan stood on the courthouse steps for a full minute after the jet disappeared, his brain struggling to process what he'd just witnessed. Around him, other people who'd been leaving the courthouse were talking in hushed, excited tones. "Did you see that Rolls-Royce? That was a private jet. Must have cost millions." "Who was that woman?" Marcus Webb, Jonathan's attorney, put his phone away and looked at his client with an expression that suggested concern mixed with realization. "Jonathan, I need to ask you something. During your divorce proceedings, did Catherine ever mention anyone named Alexandre Beaumont?" "No. Who is that?" "He's—" Marcus pulled out his phone and showed Jonathan a search result. "He's one of the wealthiest investors in the world, French-American businessman. Net worth estimated at around $8 billion, primarily in tech investments, real estate, and hedge funds." Jonathan stared at the photo on Marcus's phone. It was the same man who just helped Catherine into the Rolls-Royce. Same silver hair, same distinguished appearance, same expensive suit. "That's him," Jonathan said, his voice hollow. "That's the man who just picked up my ex-wife. When did she meet him? I don't know. I didn't know she'd met anyone. Jonathan's voice was rising, drawing attention from people nearby. He lowered it. During the separation, I assumed she was living alone somewhere. She never mentioned seeing anyone. Jonathan, if she's been involved with Beaumont, and if he's been supporting her financially, we may have missed assets in the divorce settlement. What do you mean missed assets? I mean, if Beaumont was providing financial support, or if Catherine had access to resources we didn't know about. She may have been hiding assets offshore, or... But she signed everything. She agreed to the settlement. Because she didn't need your assets, Marcus said, the realization dawning on his face. She let you keep the house, the business, the investments, because she had access to significantly more money elsewhere. Jonathan, an $8 billion net worth makes your entire portfolio look like pocket change. Jonathan felt his stomach drop. But we disclosed all assets. She would have had to disclose, not if the assets weren't in her name, not if they were gifts or support provided by someone else, not if they were structured through foreign accounts or trusts. Marcus was mentally reviewing the divorce proceedings, looking for things he'd missed. Did she fight for alimony? No, she waived it for the clean break. Did she request detailed financial discovery of your business? She asked for basic documentation, but didn't push when I provided summaries. Did she demand appraisals of property or valuations of investments? No. She accepted the values I provided. Marcus closed his eyes. Jonathan, I think we've been played. She wasn't rolling over because she was defeated. She was accepting your terms because they didn't matter to her. She was buying her freedom, not fighting for assets. But that's fraud. She hid assets. We can challenge the divorce. She didn't hide her assets. She doesn't have any assets in her name that we can find. If Beaumont is supporting her, that's his money, not hers. If he's bought her property or established accounts for her benefit, those are gifts, not marital property. And if she's been seeing him after your separation began, that's not adultery under Virginia law because you were already separated. Jonathan's hands were shaking. So, I just gave her everything she wanted, a quick, clean divorce with no fight, while she had a billionaire waiting in the wings. It appears so. How long has she been seeing him? I don't know, but Jonathan, think about it. She was very calm during all proceedings. She didn't seem concerned about money. She accepted terms that would leave most people in financial difficulty without any stress. That suggests she knew she had resources elsewhere. Jonathan pulled out his phone and searched for Alexandre Beaumont. The results were immediate and extensive. Alexandre Beaumont, net worth $8.2 billion, French-American investor, founder of Beaumont Capital Partners, with holdings in technology, real estate, and hedge funds. Known for private investments and low public profile. Recently expanded into U.S. real estate markets with $2.3 billion acquisition of commercial properties. There were photos. Beaumont at charity galas, Beaumont meeting with world leaders, Beaumont's yacht in Monaco, Beaumont's estates in France and California, and there, in a recent photo from a charity event 3 months ago, was Catherine, standing beside Beaumont at a fundraiser in Washington, D.C., both dressed formally, both smiling. The caption read, Alexandre Beaumont and companion at the National Gallery of Art benefit dinner, 3 months ago, before the divorce was finalized. During the separation, when Jonathan had assumed Catherine was living modestly somewhere, struggling with the reality of life without access to his income. Instead, she'd been attending black-tie galas with an $8 billion investor. She lied to me, Jonathan said, his voice shaking with anger. She pretended she was struggling. She acted like she needed the settlement money, and all along she had this billionaire supporting her. She didn't lie. She just didn't disclose. And legally, she didn't have to if the relationship began after separation, and if she's not claiming his assets as hers. So what do I do? Legally, probably nothing. The divorce is finalized. She didn't commit fraud. She just didn't fight for assets because she didn't need them. Ethically, it may feel deceptive, but legally, she was within her rights. Jonathan stood on the courthouse steps, watching the sky where the private jet had disappeared, slowly realizing the full extent of what had just happened. He'd spent the entire divorce proceedings mocking Catherine, telling her she was getting nothing, telling her she should have fought harder, telling her she'd be taking the bus home, and she'd let him talk, let him gloat, let him think he'd won, because she was getting on a private jet, because she was being picked up by a man whose net worth made Jonathan's assets look like poverty, because she'd already moved on to a life Jonathan couldn't even imagine, let alone access. His phone buzzed. A text from Jennifer, his girlfriend. How'd it go? Did you keep everything? Jonathan stared at the text, unable to respond. Yes, he'd kept everything. The house, the business, the cars, the investments. Approximately $2 million in total assets that he'd fought hard to protect from his ex-wife. Meanwhile, his ex-wife had just been picked up by someone worth 4,000 times that amount. He'd won the battle and lost the war, and he'd been so busy celebrating his victory that he hadn't noticed he was fighting for scraps while Catherine was positioning herself for empire. Part 3. The truth emerges. Over the next few days, Jonathan became obsessed with understanding how he'd missed what now seemed obvious. He hired a private investigator to trace Catherine's movements during the separation. What he discovered made everything worse. 14 months ago, Jonathan and Catherine's marriage had been deteriorating. Jonathan had been working long hours building his real estate business, spending less time at home, becoming increasingly dismissive of Catherine's concerns about their relationship. Catherine had been working as a marketing consultant, but had been considering a career change. 12 months ago, Jonathan had begun an affair with Jennifer, a paralegal at his business attorney's office. He'd been careless, late nights, unexplained absences, hotel charges on credit cards he'd thought Catherine didn't check. 11 months ago, Catherine had discovered the affair. She'd found texts, receipts, evidence that was undeniable. She'd confronted Jonathan. He'd admitted it, but blamed her. She'd been too focused on her career, too independent, not supportive enough. The argument had been terrible. Catherine had moved into the guest room that night. 10 months ago, Catherine had filed for separation. She'd moved out of the house into an apartment Jonathan had assumed she could barely afford. She'd told him she wanted space to think about whether the marriage was salvageable. Jonathan had assumed this meant she was preparing to accept the affair and learn to live with it, that she needed time to come to terms with her reduced leverage now that she'd moved out. But what Jonathan hadn't known, what the private investigator now revealed, was what Catherine had been doing during that separation. 9 months ago, Catherine had attended a technology investment conference in San Francisco as part of her consulting work. She'd been helping a small tech startup with their marketing strategy and had accompanied the founder to the conference to network. At that conference, she'd met Alexandra Beaumont, who'd been a keynote speaker. They'd talked about technology trends, about the future of digital marketing, about the ways artificial intelligence was changing business. Catherine had impressed him with her insights. He'd given her his card and suggested they stay in touch. 8 months ago, Beaumont had contacted Catherine about consulting for one of his portfolio companies, a tech firm that needed marketing expertise. The consulting contract had paid $50,000 for 3 months of work. Catherine had taken the job. 7 months ago, Catherine and Beaumont had begun meeting regularly, initially for business, then for dinners after business meetings, then for social occasions that had nothing to do with work. Beaumont had been recently widowed, his wife of 30 years having passed away from cancer 2 years earlier. He'd found Catherine's intelligence and resilience compelling. She'd found his maturity and stability refreshing after years with Jonathan's ego and infidelity. 6 months ago, their relationship had become romantic. Beaumont had asked Catherine if she was truly done with her marriage or if she was hoping for reconciliation. She'd been honest. Jonathan had betrayed her, dismissed her, and made it clear he valued his business and his affair more than their relationship. She wanted the divorce. She just wanted it to be clean and quick. Beaumont had offered to help, not publicly. He valued his privacy and didn't want his name associated with messy divorce proceedings. But privately, he'd offered to support Catherine financially, so she wouldn't have to fight with Jonathan over money. He'd set up a trust in her name, funded with $10 million, structured through offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands that weren't subject to U.S. discovery requirements. He'd explained to Catherine that she could let Jonathan keep the marital assets, the house, the business, the investments, because she'd have access to significantly more money through the trust. Fighting would take time, cost legal fees, and drag out the divorce. Accepting Jonathan's terms would give her freedom faster. Catherine had been reluctant at first. She'd earned those assets too. She'd contributed to the marriage. Why should she walk away with nothing while Jonathan kept everything? Beaumont had put it in perspective. The house is worth $1.2 million. The investments are $800,000. The business might be worth another $500,000. You're fighting over approximately $2.5 million in assets. I'm giving you $10 million. Let him have the $2.5 million. Buy your freedom and move forward. Catherine had agreed. 5 months ago, Catherine had instructed her attorney to accept whatever settlement terms Jonathan proposed with minimal negotiation. Her attorney had been confused and concerned, but Catherine had been insistent. 4 months ago, while Jonathan had been celebrating his negotiating victories and telling friends about how he was winning the divorce, Catherine had been house hunting in Monaco with Beaumont. She'd found a villa overlooking the Mediterranean that Beaumont had purchased for her. $8 million in her name, fully furnished, with staff. 3 months ago, Catherine had attended charity galas with Beaumont in Washington, D.C. and New York City. She'd been photographed with him at events, though media had identified her only as companion since she'd been using her maiden name and staying out of social spotlight. 2 months ago, the divorce settlement had been finalized in principle. Catherine had signed preliminary agreements accepting Jonathan's terms. He'd keep almost everything. She'd get $75,000 cash and the Honda. 1 month ago, Catherine had given notice on her apartment, the modest one-bedroom Jonathan had assumed she was struggling to afford, and had begun moving her belongings to Monaco and to a penthouse Beaumont maintained in New York City. 1 week ago, Catherine had received final confirmation that the divorce hearing was scheduled for October 26th. Yesterday, October 26th, Catherine had signed the divorce papers, walked out of the courthouse, been picked up by Beaumont's Rolls-Royce, and flown away on his private jet. Jonathan read the private investigator's report 3 times, each reading making him feel sicker. She'd played him completely. She'd let him think he was winning while she was building an entirely new life with a man worth billions. She'd let him keep the house because she had a villa in Monaco. She'd let him keep the cars because she had access to a Rolls-Royce and probably half a dozen other luxury vehicles. She'd let him keep the investments because she had a $10 million trust fund and access to Beaumont's wealth. She'd agreed to no alimony because she didn't need his money, and through it all, she'd remained calm and silent, letting Jonathan mock her, letting him think she was defeated, letting him celebrate his victory. Because she knew the truth, she'd already won. 6 months after the divorce, Jonathan's life had fundamentally changed in ways he hadn't anticipated. His relationship with Jennifer, the paralegal he'd left Catherine for, had ended badly. Jennifer had been excited about Jonathan's house and assets, had moved in 3 weeks after the divorce was finalized, and had immediately started redecorating and making plans for their future together. But as the reality of Jonathan's life became clear, he was comfortable but not wealthy, his business was solid but not spectacular, his lifestyle was nice but not luxurious, Jennifer had become increasingly dissatisfied. "I thought you were rich," she'd said during an argument 4 months after moving in. "You kept the house, you kept the business, you kept everything from the divorce." "I am comfortable. The house is worth over $1 million. With a mortgage, and your business isn't doing as well as you said. And you work all the time, but we never go anywhere nice because you say you can't afford it. Jennifer, I'm running a business. That takes time, and your ex-wife is living in Monaco with a billionaire. She's at charity galas and fashion shows and traveling on private jets. And I'm stuck here in suburban Virginia with someone who promised me a lifestyle he can't actually afford." The relationship had ended shortly after. Jennifer had moved out, taking with her several expensive items she'd convinced Jonathan to buy for her, and had immediately started dating a hedge fund manager she'd met at a bar. Jonathan was alone in the house he'd fought so hard to keep, the house that suddenly felt empty and hollow without someone to share it with, the house that needed repairs he was now responsible for paying entirely himself, the house that had represented victory but now felt like a burden. His business was struggling. During the divorce proceedings, he'd been distracted, had let client relationships slip, had made poor decisions about investments because he'd been focused on hiding assets from Catherine rather than growing them strategically. Several major deals had fallen through. His revenue was down 30% from the previous year. His friends, the ones who'd congratulated him on winning the divorce, had started pulling away when they'd learned the truth about Catherine's new life. Some felt he'd been foolish, some felt embarrassed for him. Some simply didn't want to be associated with someone who'd become a cautionary tale about assuming victory too early. And every few weeks, there was another reminder. A photo in a Society magazine, Catherine and Alexandre Beaumont at the Cannes Film Festival. A business journal article, Beaumont Capital Partners. Expanding European operations with Catherine listed as a strategic advisor. A social media post from a mutual friend. Running into Catherine in Paris. She looks amazing and so happy. Each reminder was a knife twist, a reminder that Catherine had moved on to a life Jonathan couldn't comprehend, while he was stuck in the life he'd fought to keep. One evening, Jonathan found himself doing something he'd sworn he'd never do, looking through old photos of him and Catherine from happier times in their marriage. Their wedding day, both of them young and optimistic. Their first house, smaller than the current one, but they'd been proud of it. Vacations they had taken together, Europe, the Caribbean, cross-country road trips, holidays with family, birthdays, anniversaries. Catherine laughing at something Jonathan had said, her face lit with genuine joy. Catherine supporting him when his business had nearly failed in its early years, telling him she believed in him. Catherine celebrating with him when his first major deal had closed. He'd had a real partner, someone who'd believed in him, supported him, built a life with him, and he'd destroyed it, cheated on her, dismissed her contributions, mocked her during the divorce, and then celebrated when he thought he'd taken everything from her. But he hadn't taken anything. She'd given him what he wanted, his precious house and business and investments, because they meant nothing compared to what she was getting. Freedom, a fresh start, a partner who valued her, access to a life of genuine luxury rather than Jonathan's middle class, pretension of wealth. Jonathan had won the divorce settlement and lost everything that mattered. Meanwhile, in Monaco, Catherine stood on the terrace of her villa, overlooking the Mediterranean, drinking her morning coffee and reviewing emails. She'd been working with one of Beaumont's portfolio companies on a major marketing campaign, and the results had exceeded projections. The company's CEO had offered her a permanent position as chief marketing officer with a 7-figure salary. She was considering it. Alexandra joined her on the terrace, kissed her cheek, and handed her a tablet showing news headlines. "Your old life is looking for you," he said with amusement. Catherine looked at the screen. It was an article in a Washington, D.C. business journal about successful women in consulting, featuring her prominently. The article mentioned her recent divorce, her relationship with Beaumont, and her consulting successes. It was respectful but noted the dramatic contrast between her current life and her marriage. "Does it bother you?" Alexandra asked. "The attention?" "No," Catherine said honestly. "I spent 15 years being dismissed and underestimated. If people want to talk about how I rebuilt my life after that marriage ended, that's fine. Maybe it helps other women realize they don't have to settle for relationships where they're not valued. Any regrets? About the divorce? No. About letting Jonathan keep the assets?" She thought about it. "I earned those assets too. I contributed to that marriage. There's a principle involved in walking away from what you built." But principles are expensive. Fighting would have taken years and cost me emotionally. Accepting his terms bought me freedom immediately. And you helped me see that the dollar amount I was fighting over was insignificant compared to what I could build moving forward. So no regrets? My only regret is not leaving sooner. I wasted years trying to fix a marriage with someone who didn't value what we had. But I can't change that. I can only move forward. Alexandra smiled. "Where would you like to move forward to? I have meetings in Singapore next week. Want to come?" "I'd love to." They went inside to plan their trip, flying private, staying at the Raffles, meetings with business leaders and social engagements with people Catherine was still getting used to. Billionaires, diplomats, celebrities, people for whom a $2 million real estate portfolio wasn't wealth. It was a rounding error. Catherine's phone buzzed. A text from Linda Martinez, her divorce attorney, saw the article. "You doing okay?" Catherine replied. "Doing great. Thank you for trusting me during the divorce, even when my decisions didn't make sense." "Linda, they make sense now. Congratulations on your new life. You deserve it." Catherine smiled and put the phone away. She'd built this new life not through the divorce settlement, but through her own intelligence, resilience, and willingness to walk away from a bad situation even when the immediate financial outcome looked unfavorable. She'd let Jonathan have his victory, the house, the business, the assets he'd valued so much. And she'd won her freedom and a future he'd never imagined she could access. Sometimes the best revenge wasn't taking everything from someone. It was walking away and building something so much better that what they'd kept became irrelevant. The moral. He mocked her while she signed divorce papers, joking about how she was walking away with nothing, how she'd probably take the bus home. He'd kept the house, the business, the investments, everything they'd built together. She signed without argument, without tears, without the fight he'd expected. Her silence made him crueler. He told his attorney she was finally learning her place, told her she should hurry before her ride disappeared. She just collected her purse and walked out. Outside, a private jet landed at the nearby airstrip. A Rolls-Royce pulled up. A distinguished man in an expensive suit stepped out. Alexandra Beaumont, billionaire investor worth $8 billion. He embraced her, took her bag, helped her into the car. The husband froze mid-mockery. The jet was there for her. The car drove to the tarmac. She boarded the jet without looking back. He stood on courthouse steps, realizing her silence wasn't defeat. It was strategy. She'd let him keep everything because she had access to infinitely more. While he'd been fighting for a $2 million portfolio, she'd been building a relationship with someone whose net worth made his assets look like poverty. She'd had a $10 million trust fund, a villa in Monaco, access to a life he'd never reach. She'd agreed to no alimony because she didn't need his money, accepted his terms because they didn't matter, walked away with nothing because nothing he had could compare to everything she was gaining. 6 months later, he was alone in a house. That felt empty, business struggling, relationship with the woman he'd cheated with over. She was in Monaco, working as strategic advisor for Beaumont Capital, attending galas and living the life he'd mocked her for losing. He'd won the divorce and lost everything that mattered. She'd lost the settlement and won her freedom. Sometimes the best revenge isn't taking everything. It's walking away and building something so much better that what they kept becomes irrelevant.